It happened sooner than expected. A collision involving a driverless car killed someone. That's shifted, but not ended, the conversation around autonomous vehicles, reminding policymakers, the public, and developers that there is still much left to be figured out. Joining us now to map some of that terrain, Sunil Johal. He's Policy Director at the Mowat Centre at the University of Toronto. Bern Grush, Principal at the transit think tank Grush-Nile Strategic and co-author of the forthcoming book, The End of Driving. And Alicia Sikirska, transportation reporter at the Financial Post. And we are glad to have all you three here, although we wish it were on to consider and analyze better news. This is really quite tragic. Beyond, Bern, let me start with you. Beyond the obvious tragedy of someone having lost their life in the midst of a test run for this autonomous vehicle, I'd like to know what first went through your mind when you heard the news.
Well, first thing was that this accident shouldn't have occurred. The technology that recognizes cyclists and recognizes pedestrian is well established any time of day or night. So that was a shocking surprise, actually. I think the second part of that is that the fact of a pedestrian being so vulnerable to these accidents is also really shocking.
Yeah, she really was completely caught unawares by this car, which came upon her literally in a fraction of a second.
It looks like at full speed.
Alicia, your thoughts when you first heard about this?
I think, first of all, this is obviously a tragic incident, and one that came far too soon in the short history of automated vehicles.
How do you mean by that?
Well, in the US, there is one fatality per 100 million vehicle miles traveled on average. And the reality is that these autonomous fleets have not traveled anywhere close to that kind of mileage. Uber is believed to be around the 2 million mark. Waymo, which is considered to be a leader in this field, around 5 million miles. So the fact that it happened so soon, unless there's nothing else that happens for the next 95 million miles or so, this happened far too soon.
So statistically speaking, the odds on this should not have happened this early in the game.
Correct.
Gotcha. Okay. Sunil, your view.
So, first, obviously, this was a tragedy, and my condolences to the victim's family. But secondly, when I heard that this had happened in Arizona, that was not necessarily a surprise. That's the jurisdiction which has had really the lightest touch approach to regulating these vehicles. They've subsequently, earlier this week, actually banned Uber specifically from testing autonomous vehicles in the state. But interestingly, they aren't banning the other companies, so GM and Waymo and others. And in fact, they're actually going to be loosening restrictions on those companies. They won't actually require a backup driver in the car at all, as they've just passed a new executive order a few weeks ago. So they're kind of continuing along this path of having a relatively hands-off approach. And for a lot of governments, including Ontario, California, Michigan, this is a really interesting space because on the one hand, you want to attract investment and you want to be the jurisdiction which is building these cars, testing them open to their existence in effect. But on the other hand, how do you balance that public safety concern? And I think that's a real challenge for policymakers. You want to be innovative, but at the same time, you need to be safe. And how do we make sure we're drafting regulations that meet both of those objectives?
You said two words there I want to follow up on, and those two words are backup driver. And to that end, we're not going to show the video of the accident because that's really quite gruesome, and it's all over YouTube. And if anybody wants to find it, I'm sure they can. But let's show this. This is the interior of the autonomous vehicle, and there is the backup driver who is looking down and then back up and then back down and then back up, and to her horror sees that she is about to have a collision and kill somebody. Bern, what's the point of a backup driver if a backup driver isn't being a backup driver?
Well, first of all, the job of being a backup driver is extraordinarily difficult. And the reason is that there's almost nothing to do for long stretches of time. Some of these backup drivers are on 8 or 10 hours a day, sort of in 4-hour stretches. And to sit there with nothing happening at all is extraordinarily difficult. So that's one aspect of it. And human attention is a problem throughout all of this. And by the way, that's one of the reasons that Waymo has elected not to use level 3 cars. In other words, not to produce vehicles that will require a backup driver at all. And I think that's very important. And the other part of this, and sadly, is that this particular driver was paid to attend. not the same as the Tesla accident from a year and a half before, in which that driver owned the vehicle and was sort of his own fault for not paying attention. In this case, this person was responsible for paying attention for the lives of others. I think that's a huge mark against the process of using backup drivers that are not somehow enforced that they're watching what their job is.
How big a setback is this, in your view, to the whole autonomous vehicle testing regime?
I think that's the big question, and as of right now, it looks like Uber is bearing the brunt of this. Toyota did follow suit in pausing their autonomous vehicle testing. But aside from that, it's kind of business as usual. Just this week, Waymo announced that they're expanding their robotaxi fleet.
Who owns them again? Waymo?
That's at Google.
Google,
it began as a
right.
self-driving company under Google. It's now owned by Alphabet Inc. And this week they announced that they were adding 20,000 Jaguar vehicles to their robotaxi fleet, which is actually going to start in Phoenix. So it really is I think over the long term, it's not going to hinder this development. In the short term, I think Uber is definitely going to feel this. They're not going to reapply for their license in California until the investigation is finished. So short term, there are some implications, but it appears as though all the other companies are still going ahead.
What's your view on whether or not this ought to slow things down?
Well, we need to consider how it is that we set up safety drivers and how it is that we set up the systems behind the systems that are up front. In other words, the system that was intended to have this accident not occur, it's claimed, and we're not sure, was turned off. We don't know that that's happened, but there's no reason to turn off the systems that are known to work. It is known that we can avoid pedestrian accidents. If we want to find out if we can leave out parts of the system, if we want to find out if we can exclude lead, or if we want to find out if we can do it with fewer sensors, you still need to leave all the other backup systems in place. If those were turned off, I think that's a serious problem.
Sunil, I want to be very careful that this is not misinterpreted, this question I'm about to ask, because I don't want it to sound insensitive. But the reality is, I don't think the autonomous vehicle industry ever promised that there would never, ever be an accident on their watch. I think what they promised was, statistically speaking, computers can drive better than people, and therefore there will be fewer. Do we have to remember that at a time like this?
We do. I mean, it's been estimated that 90% of car crashes are as a result of human error. We also know that 1,800 people a year die in Canada as a result of motor vehicle fatalities. So it's quite likely that this technology in the long run could make a significant dent in those fatality and injury numbers. The issue is, in the short term, these cars have not perfected the technology. Their algorithms aren't bulletproof, and to get better, they need to be tested in real-world conditions on our city streets. And the question then becomes, how comfortable are we allowing these big tech firms and car makers to essentially use our city streets as laboratories where citizens are lab mice in that experiment, and we're letting them test that technology to perfect it for their own profit incentive. I mean, yes, ultimately there is a public interest in reducing car crashes and injuries, but we've also seen car companies have been very good at that on their own. I mean, without autonomous vehicles, the fatality rate has dropped by about in half over the past 20 years or so. So the question becomes, how comfortable are we as a society allowing tech firms to experiment on our city streets? And it's really unprecedented. There's very few examples I can think of where we've let private firms just kind of write the rules on their own for something that, quite honestly, is obviously quite dangerous. You're talking about 5,000-10,000 pound vehicles driving around, driven by computers. I mean, that's a little concerning, and we really need to make sure we've got the right rules in place and we're protecting people who didn't sign up to be a part of this experiment, quite honestly.
But apparently they're dazzled by the potential that they're prepared to turn the roads over to private companies.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, the issue here is, unlike a lot of technology firms, technology opportunities, autonomous vehicles actually have a manufacturing component to them. So, I mean, this isn't like experimenting with blockchain technology or something. This is something that could lead to manufacturing jobs, software jobs. So for jurisdictions like Ontario, California, and Michigan, there's a competition to show we're open to and we're friendly to this type of investment.
Alicia, just take 30 seconds here before we broaden the discussion and tell us who are the big players in this field?
So just about everyone is trying to get in on this. We have so-called technology firms such as Uber and Google's Waymo. They're very much leaders in this game. And then we also have traditional automakers that want to make sure that their cars are ready for this whenever that autonomous vehicles hit the road. So we have GM has the Cruise, which they are going to mass produce at some point. It's their autonomous vehicle. They want to introduce a robotaxi fleet to a city in the US by 2019. Ford has set 2021 as their target for their robotaxi fleet. And then we also have technology firms such as BlackBerry that works on the algorithms and the software that you see in a lot of these autonomous vehicles, although to be noted, not the Uber car.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us any kind of educated guess as to when automated vehicles are going to be commonplace on our roads?
If I knew that, I'd probably be in Las Vegas right now making a lot of money. But I mean, if you look at what the leading experts in the field, they were asked that exact same question 2 or 3 years ago, and most of their predictions were 2028, 2030. They were all, people went back to them and asked them much more recently in the past year, what do you think in terms of mass market adoption of this technology? And the guesses are now 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So I think the advances have been very significant over the past 2 or 3 years, and that's shifting the timeline forward. So I don't think this is decades away. I think this is years away, whether it's 5 years, 3 years, 7 years. And I mean, there are also other questions around, I mean, the expense of this is going to be very high early on. This isn't going to be something the average person is going to go out and buy. It's probably going to be at the fleet level. It's going to be the Ubers, the GMs of the world who are saying, hey, look, this is a taxi service. Essentially, you can hop into an autonomous vehicle, get out, go wherever you want to go. It's going to be a while before the average person is going to be buying one of these cars, but I think the technology is moving very quickly. I mean, this is literally $1 trillion marketplace globally in terms of all the spin-off industries that we're looking at.
Well, let me follow up with Alicia on that, because I mean, clearly all of the big automakers that you just listed, they are absolutely convinced that this is going to be something that consumers are going to be in love with and demand. How do we know?
I mean, I think there's the plan is definitely first to go with companies like Uber or Lyft and offer ride sharing, because I think there is a huge obstacle here in that human sentiment and trust factor.
Yes.
Essentially, this is not going to help also, this incident, but people are still wary of using this technology. There was a survey recently by DeRosier Automotive and found that more than 50% of Canadians would be willing to use one of these vehicles. But when it comes to ownership, that drops down to 30%. So people are still wary of this technology.
They're from Missouri, as they say. Show me, eh? They still want to be shown. If, okay, I'm going to oversimplify things a little bit here, Bern, just for the heck of it. But basically, because I want you to put on your your forecasting glasses for a second here. People get to work one of two ways, basically. They either drive themselves or they pick some other alternative, taxi, public transit, walk, cycle, whatever. When these AVs, autonomous vehicles, are all over our roads, how do you see that changing?
So that, you need to ask what does it mean by an AV? So there are AVs that I could own, and I could turn on the automation system and kick back, and I could turn it off and drive. And that is the kind of vehicle that will be owned, and those are already available. There's at least a couple that I know of that you can buy like that. They only operate on highways and so forth. That vehicle will be plentiful over the next few years. They will be owned by the 30% that you described from the DeRosier study. The other kind of vehicle, which is driverless, the one we hope we're going to have soon, the one that Waymo is working on, the one that Uber is working on as well. That vehicle is going to be geofenced. It's going to be limited in the extent of the roads that it can go on. It has to be highly mapped, for instance, before they can go on those roads. So that we think of that as robo-taxis and robo-shuttles. And what that's the kind of systems that's going to take us to work and to those common trips that we take locally. There's not the vehicle that's going to take us to the cottage or off on a longer sort of an unusual trip like that. And what we see happening is that the world of robo-taxis and robo-shuttles will encroach on the existing taxis, the existing bus systems, existing transit systems. And if you observe what's happening now with ride-hailing companies like Uber and Lyft, encroaching on transit ridership and so forth, that's going to tick up tremendously. So there's really two markets, as you identified. There's a market of using some other vehicle to get somewhere. That will be taken over by the robo-taxis and robo-shuttles. And there's the market of I own my own car and drive where I want to. That's already here. It's in very small numbers. I'm sure there's only a few hundred of those vehicles now already in Ontario, but that will tick up.
So the potential for disruption to the way things happen right now, Sunil, is off the charts.
It's huge. I mean, we could completely see city planning, where people live. I mean, the potential here is, well, if land is expensive in Toronto, I can't afford a home here, why don't I buy something 3 hours away and I can actually sleep in my car on my trip into work. I mean, we could completely revolutionize transportation, how people live, social patterns, all kinds of different things. But I mean, the question again comes back to, for me, it always comes back to me as a public policy person, is what's the public interest here, and how can we shape the kind of future that we want with smart, effective rulemaking? I mean, we have a lot of cities in Canada right now, which people would argue have been essentially destroyed by the car. I mean, cars have set us into this urban landscape that is not conducive to pedestrians, not conducive to bikes. Are we going to let that happen again with autonomous vehicles, or are we going to design smart cities, smart roadways that enable us to enjoy all kinds of different ways of living, not just car-centric modes of transportation?
The car that's giving us sprawl, that's the
Yes.
car that you've described, is coming up way faster than we can smarten up any cities. Just look at the effort that it took for the King Street. Look at the effort that it took for the Queen's Quay. Look what's happened at the Union Station for just in our own location. How fast can we build these smart streets and smart highways and smart cities and smart communities?
Not fast enough, you're saying?
Oh my God, no.
The answer is
No.
definitely not fast enough. And this is a situation of technology moving so quickly and government policymakers and regulators, by necessity, having to move much more slowly. And as the lag gets bigger and bigger, it becomes harder and harder for them to catch up and put the genie back in the model. And I think that's what the real concern here is, that these firms and these car companies are writing the rules and they're setting the path that it makes sense for them, but that might not really make sense for the average person.
Congestion, of course, is a big thing on most big cities in this country. Do we infer that once AVs become omnipresent on our roads, congestion is going to be even 10 times worse? Did you make that assumption?
I don't want to be making assumptions about the future in that way, but I think that is one of the concerns with AVs as well. I know companies like GM, they actually tout their autonomous policy as zero crashes, zero emissions, zero collisions as part of their electric vehicles as well. But that congestion question is something that especially as Byrne was saying, that these autonomous vehicles, you're going to see them as ride-sharing services, and so that's putting more cars on the road. So it could potentially, because it also, those users that maybe have turned to buses previously are going to be turning to these robo-taxis.
This is what I mean.
Yeah.
In which case, there's just way more of them out there, isn't there?
Well, that's exactly what we've seen happen with the ride-sharing firms, that the data is new and we don't have a lot of firm evidence, but it all is pointing in the direction of firms like Uber and Lyft are putting more cars on the road. They're contributing to congestion in major cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco. And exactly as Alicia has just said, if autonomous vehicles are a preferred route for most people, which they are. I mean, I'd rather sit in my own personal car than go on a subway or go on a bus. That's going to induce more people into these cars for trips. It's going to take them off of public transit, and that's not what we want. So, I mean, theoretically, they can drive closer together and we can fit more of these cars on the road because they can go at high speeds very close together. But if there's so many more of them, I think that really undoes all of those beneficial effects.
So here's the $64,000 question, as they used to call it back in the day. 100 yards north of this studio, there is a $5.5 billion LRT line going in. That is, I mean, I think it's the biggest construction project anywhere in Canada right now. It's just massive. And, you know, it's not going to be finished for another 3-4 years yet. They say 3, but I'm betting 4. Anyway, does it make sense to be spending billions upon billions of dollars on future public transit projects when, given what Sunil just said, people for not much more money might just be much happier to be in their own AV chucking along Eglinton, you know, by themselves as opposed to getting on an LRT?
Absolutely critical question. If you find ways to move people with these first and last mile robo-taxis, if you find ways to move them to transit hubs or transit stations, in other words, imagine an urban train system with stations, you know, a couple of kilometers apart, and you're funneling people in with all these robo vehicles, but stacking those heavy vehicles to bring people downtown, that could work. If those train stations are spaced very closely, and it takes me far longer to go through 15 stops than to just stay in the robotaxi and go downtown. I'm going to stay in the robotaxi because I'm already in there and I can work or I can snooze or whatever. We need to make it very easy and inexpensive to funnel people into our train systems that we're still investing in, and that we haven't built enough of either. So if we just build the train stations and ignore the existing systems, ignore the ride providers will in fact improve the autonomous technology, and they're going to drive people through it, and we will then have a far worse congestion problem from that as well. It really comes down to the vehicle that is driven, the new vehicle that has to have a human operator in it, is going to give us more sprawl, and sprawl gives us congestion. You can't escape that part of the equation. So however many people own them increases that. The robo-taxis will detract from bus transit at least. However many of those, we lose our bus more quickly. So whichever way this balance tips, you're either going to lose you're going to harm your transit system, or you're going to harm congestion and sprawl. You pick one. The truth
Pick
is,
your poison.
The truth is we're going to have some of each, and both of them are going to be a concern.
There's an incredible irony right now, Alicia, in the fact that, the current government of Ontario is investing in public transit infrastructure in a way that we haven't seen in maybe 30 years, maybe 60 years. And they're doing it at a time when AVs may render much of it unnecessary.
Right.
That's kind of a frightening possibility if you think about all the money that's going towards all these projects.
Yes, most definitely. But to be fair to Ontario, they are the only place in Canada right now that's allowing for testing of these automated vehicles on public roads, with a permit, of course. But yeah, I think as both of you were saying, there's this balance that needs to be struck here with meeting the needs that are necessary today, the transit needs of everybody, and then as well looking forward and making sure that we don't fall behind as this technology is being introduced, and introducing a framework that balances those needs.
Sunil.
The challenge here for governments is the tail of their decisions in terms of things like infrastructure decisions is decades long. Once you've built the crosstown LRT, that's there for 50, 60 years. But the world we live in is changing so quickly, and the technologies that we are seeing emerging are so disruptive that I'm very wary of any decision that has a 50 or 60 year tail. That's the challenge here. We need more public transit, we know that, but how can we be sure that the decisions we're making, is Eglinton the right decision, or should we have been building a downtown relief line?
Can I give you another example?
Sure.
How about this one? How about the City of Toronto's about to spend $4.5 billion on a one-stop subway to Scarborough, when it almost certainly would be cheaper just to buy everybody their own AV?
Well, I can guarantee you that decision is not a good one. I'll go on the record saying the one-stop subway is not a smart decision from a whole range of different perspectives.
That won't be done for 20 years.
No.
And truthfully, you could probably buy everybody their own AV for the money they're going to spend on that subway system, and it would be cheaper.
Well, one thing that's not considered is build that one-stop station, bring in everybody from that region, buy all these robotic vehicles to that station, don't have any stops along it, which is what's planned, and funnel people in downtown that way. Now, that sounds really bizarre, but if you made that free, instead of having people pay $30 or $10 or whatever to take an AV, have them pay $2 to get on that station and have that ride for free. That's not considered, but you need to have large vehicles. If you want to move lots of people into a city, you need to do that with large vehicles. So that's why my work is vilified by those that are concerned about buses and trains, because I'm saying that this is going to be disrupted. I'm not saying like I hope it's disrupted. I'm saying it's going to be disrupted. I'm looking for ways, and I work with a company now that looks for ways that government regulate these taxi and shuttle systems. Instead of building their own, acquiring their own, and building their own, we need to stop, government needs to stop acquiring and operating these systems, and it needs to start specifying and regulating. We need to regulate what the entrepreneurs are doing, and we're not doing that.
We're seeing this happen already. I think it was maybe a year ago that we had Lynn Dolan, who's either the mayor or the deputy mayor from Innisfil, come on our program and tell us. She's one of your heroes, isn't she?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, because she's not going to buy buses for the town. She's subsidizing Uber rides, and anybody who wants public transit will take Uber. Is that the future?
This is a place where those autonomous vehicles could fit in along with the public transit system quite seamlessly, replacing the Uber fleet that they're using right now, which they got instead of buses because they found it would be cheaper to subsidize Uber than it would be to pay for, and with the operating costs and then upfront costs of 2 buses that the entire city might not use because they don't live near them. Autonomous vehicles could, replace those Ubers and could just be fetching people from around the city of Innisfil to the GO train station, and then that would be it. Like, the people would transit into the city on GO train, and it would be exactly what Byrne was saying.
Well, what's brilliant about what Innisfil did is that they only subsidize rides that are shared. You can't get an Uber, just a single passenger Uber ride and get the subsidy. You have to be willing to share your ride.
So it is public transit in that respect.
That's right, and I congratulate them for getting that. You can't just subsidize anything. You have to subsidize things that are appropriate for the that provide environmental justice as well as social justice of getting the transit.
Gotcha. You wanted to add?
I mean, really, it's about governments becoming market shapers and makers, and as Byrne said, not operating every single lever and widget in the toolbox. And that's something that we're not used to in the transit space. We're used to government being the sole monopolistic provider of these services. And I mean, we have to build more subways, we have to build more transit, but we also have to think about what's that ecosystem of the first mile, last mile problem. The problem for most people is not, it's how do I get from my house to a transit stop? And if that's a bus, and if I have 3 or 4 connections, that takes me an hour and a half, 2 hours, one way. That's not going to be convenient, and that's where we have to think about how can we develop a much smarter mix of public provision of these big high-order transit lines, and then those first mile, last mile connections that can get me from Union Station to my job at college in Bathurst quickly and efficiently. And that might not be a streetcar, it might not be a bus, it might be a microbus with 10 people who pay $2 or $3 each, and it's operated by a private sector entity.
Okay.
The major conundrum is that planners, the way to optimize planning is large vehicles and fixed routes. The way to optimize our trip is to get from my house to there in our car. So that all the people that we're serving, their optimal world is the opposite of the optimal world of people doing the planning. And until we somehow come together and close that gap, we are going to continue the same problems that we have now. We're just going to continue, just going to get bigger and faster and automated. We're going to automate the wrong thing.
Friends, you can put away your crystal balls now, and our time here is done. But we thank you for looking into them for us for the past half hour. Byrne Grush, the principal at Grush-Nile Strategic. Alicia Sekirska, transportation reporter from the Financial Post. Sunil Johal, policy director at the Mowat Center, the public policy think tank at the U of T. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.